Hello, and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lappa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Today, I'm joined by Tracy Kronzak to talk about the impact economy and partnerships for good. Tracy, welcome to the show.
Hey, Alex, thank you so much for having me. And a true fact is that this is my very first solo podcast interview ever. So thank you.
But you do have a lot of podcast experience, so this isn't the first time you're in front of a microphone, though, right?
Oh, gosh, no. I used to joke all the time that my favorite state of being was something along the lines of like, hey, Tracy, there's 500 people outside. You've got 3 minutes to prep, but I need you to grab this mic and talk about some esoteric element of technology or technology and impact organizations. Go. And that's kind of the flavor that myself and my co-podcaster, Tim Lockey, we put into both of our endeavors. A while back, we had a podcast called Cloud TNT that was focused exclusively on Salesforce and nonprofits. And we had the opportunity to restart our podcasting in 2020. And now we have a podcast called Why It Matters, which it's very much a labor of love. And it's very much when we get the time to do it. But we have a lot of these discussions around what does it mean for nonprofits to engage in the world? What does impact organization work look like with technology? And occasionally we talk to each other and occasionally we have guests as well.
Awesome. So before we get into all the glory and juicy details, can you give us your superhero origin story? That is, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
Sure. I love that you call it a superhero origin story, because it does drill me right into the massive tome of useless knowledge I have about things ranging from Dungeons and Dragons to the X-Men to, maybe the Marvel Universe. So I'm going to dial it back to when I was in college, back when the dinosaurs ruled the earth. And that was a different challenge because you'd walk outside your dorm room and they would try to steal your food. But I very much fell into technology for nonprofits after doing an undergraduate degree in Eastern European Studies and Policy Analysis and a graduate degree in public administration. So I was originally thinking I would be a policy analyst or a policymaker. And somewhere along the way, I think what happened was I saw very much how under-resourced technology was for any given charitable or nonprofit organization. And I started by doing simple things like convincing the finance officers or, the CEOs to give me $500 to literally buy a 486 or a Pentium socket swap upgrade chip for their computers so that we didn't have to spend a lot of money on buying new systems when we didn't need to. And that turned into, I knew I was a nonprofit technologist when in the early 2000s, I got into a fight with the executive director of the organization I worked for because he wanted to spend like $200 on a super used, super terrible, like kind of rehabbed, kind of not computer for himself. And I quadrupled that and bought him an actual real PC, and he was thrilled with it. So, that got me into hard technology. I was sincerely interested in building rack servers and running Ethernet cable and doing all the things necessary to support our offices for many years. And that turned into cloud computing, which turned into cloud consulting, which turned into me presenting on technology strategy for many, many years at the nonprofit, the N10. I guess they just go by N10 now, but it used to be the Nonprofit Technology Network conferences. And ultimately, I wound up working for or alongside of several major big tech companies that also wanted to serve nonprofits. So I worked for the former salesforce.org, which really doesn't exist anymore. I am on the advisory for Microsoft Tech for Social Impact because they're doing some super interesting work. And most recently, I worked for a sort of hyper compu global megamart called Bonterra that was sort of one business that tried to cobble together 4 or 5 different acquisitions and then laid off a bunch of us in the process. So I've been on all sides of that equation of nonprofits and technology, and it's always something that is very close to my heart. And I think if I had to pick a Marvel hero, I would always pick somebody who's just a little bit of an outsider. So the folks that always appealed to me were like Jean Grey or Scarlet Witch. That's kind of the stripe that I liked in those stories.
We have a lot of similar overlapping interests because I used to play Dungeons and Dragons too when I was a kid. X-Men, I liked. Marvel, of course.
Yep.
And do you remember, you talked about old computers, Pentium and stuff like that. Do you remember back in the day, there was only IBM computers and then they called them clones. It was like
clones. That's
the
right.
words they used for non-IBM computers. And they always had that turbo button. When you click the turbo button, everything goes faster for some reason.
Everything goes faster, and they didn't quite get the clock speeds right on the software. So like some of the things you didn't want to go faster were also going faster. It was a great time.
It was a great time, the classic days. But that's
It
another
really
conversation.
was.
Yeah, let's talk maybe more about the present than the past, because I would reminisce for an hour if we could.
Me too.
Could you give us a little definition of what impact economy is?
Yes, absolutely. So impact economy is a expression of my own creation. And I started using it about 3 years, 4 years ago. And there are people who will vouch for the exact moment that I came up with it. And why it's something that I am passionate about is because one of the things that I was trained as a policy analyst was looking at the systems of things and how they fit together to create aggregate gains and aggregate externalities. So along my very sort of storied career and places I've been, I started noticing things. And one of the things I started noticing was we have gone through several cycles of change outs with technology for nonprofits, but yet the system of organizations, what I call impact organizations, because nonprofits here in the United States is just a tax designation, but impact organizations can be fiscally sponsored organizations. They can be international organizations. They can be short-term collaboratives that work together to solve a specific problem and then disband. What I noticed was that even though we have gone through several massive change outs of technology for these types of organizations, they actually are still struggling with the same issues that I struggled with 20 some odd years ago in technology. And the fallacy of some of what's going on in big tech has been, we went to someplace like Blackbaud in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, and Blackbaud said, yes, adopt us and we will save you. That did not come true. And in fact, what a lot of organizations did was adopt long-term contracts, but the capacity to understand and work with technology hadn't changed. Salesforce came along and did some super innovative things around building community around technology. And that actually started moving the needle 10 years ago or more, because what it revealed was nonprofits solve their problems collaboratively, and the best practice for use of technology can be solved as a community. And again, what has happened with Salesforce is they've completely disbanded that endeavor. So what was Salesforce Foundation and what was Salesforce.org doesn't exist anymore. And even in my last job, I went in saying, if you want to rebuild this, This is an investment of time and distance. It's not a, we're going to make sales for next quarter kind of thinking. So what I call the impact economy is a different lens of thinking about what happens when, instead of putting next quarter's profit or next month's revenue or booking as much revenue as possible through license sales and service sales, what happens if we take that out of the center of the natural behavior of businesses and instead say, what are the components that any given business can contribute to that will actually help move a greater needle for how impact organizations do their work with technology? And sometimes what that means is saying impact is a longer distance target and a more steady pace of acquisition and sales than revenue. So I'm trying to offer a system of things together, which is how businesses can shift their lens of thinking, how data should be free and liberated for nonprofits, and how nonprofits themselves can find ways to continue bolstering their capacity to adopt and keep technology for the long term together. And I put together a little model based on that thinking and threw it out on LinkedIn. But I've been using impact economy as a word for this system. And it is a systems thinking kind of endeavor because it challenges the assumptions around what it means to sell software to nonprofits and impact organizations.
There's obviously multiple differences between these impact economy and the revenue economy that we would refer to as a normal corporation. So I love it because I do agree that a lot of times companies unfortunately focus a bit too much on that next quarterly revenue amount and not how are we helping the world kind of thing. Is there a balance between the two? Is it one or the other? I imagine there must be some kind of gray zone between the two. And how would you define the boundaries of when you know you're contributing enough toward the impact economy?
Great question. First of all, these things don't stand in opposition to each other. What it offers is a gamut of choices that a business can make, and those choices will define their level of participation in the impact economy. And some choose not to. It is very clear that entities like Salesforce, like Blackbaud, like Bonterra, and a few others have said, you know what? All we're going to do is aim for as quick of a sale as possible to whomever will buy our stuff. And therefore, all we need to do is tell you, the organization that is about to buy our software, a good enough story about how you can succeed with our stuff to make that sale possible, right? That's the part that this is a antidote to. Because if you go to the other end of that spectrum, what you learn is that while these types of models work for the corporate and the business to business and frankly, business to consumer sales very well, what nonprofits need to succeed with technology is greater than a simple technology platform or application can solve. They need things like community. They need things like best practice. They need things like human capacity. And that's not the same, by the way, as organizational change management, although that is also something they do develop as part of adopting any given technology. So this is very much a choose your own adventure for businesses who want to actually invest more than simply a good sales and marketing team into selling to impact organizations. And it can be as lightweight as here is a freemium model that kind of picks and chooses from some of these elements and has very clearly defined boundaries and parameters. And it can be as elaborate as entities like the former Salesforce Foundation and Salesforce.org were creating to produce that needle motion in a different direction.
What would an organization need to do? So, what would be the markers, I guess, or need to do to be able to participate? Like, if there's a whole bunch of levers and you know you can, not just levers, but you mentioned levels of participation.
Sure.
I get this. I see the benefits of it. I see the desire to do it, and I see the need to do it. What would be the motivation for the organization to do it? Like, why do you think Salesforce stopped doing this impact economy? Why did they stop being involved in this and withdrew themselves? Because they were, you're right, totally involved for such a long period of time. Do you have any idea of like why they would do that to help answer the question of how do we motivate other organizations not just to start, but also to stay in that kind of
How do they stay in the zone?
stay in the zone? Yeah.
You know what's funny is you're asking this question on the same day that there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that, specifically talked about Salesforce. And the title of the article was awful. And that is, "You're all family until times get hard." But it was an excoriation of Salesforce's behavior, not just with impact organizations, but with its entire staff over the past 6 months. Now, I can say that one of the things that article points out is that a new set of investors have come into Salesforce, and there are investors in this world whose only purpose is to extract as much revenue as possible over as short a period of time once they get control over a business entity. And that is just what we call capitalism being capitalism. And these companies make their money by downsizing things that don't look like revenue producers. They make their money by taking away things that look like time that is distractive from the sales cycle. And then some of them create incredibly toxic cultures inside of these organizations. So, where does it start? It starts actually by talking and finding the right type of investors in organizations that have software that purports to serve nonprofits. So this is a very high level discussion with venture capital firms that essentially apply this revenue extraction model to businesses that have garnered huge followings of nonprofits globally. And that's what happened, I think, at Salesforce. And that's what that Wall Street Journal article points out. Now, why organizations choose not to participate in this is because, for the same reason that I have ridden sidecar to 3 different enterprise sales teams in my career, and they all say the same thing, and that is, why does selling to these damn organizations take so long and so much effort? And it's something that you only learn when you start implementing software for nonprofits, and that is the churn rate of staff and the ability to make durable decisions is limited by 9 to 18 months. And it's eminently possible that when you get into selling or implementing or applying technology to an impact organization, the team that you started with and the team that you ended with are going to be 2 different teams. That happens all the time. And it's frustrating to you as a consultant or as a business because those people get to the end of the process. They're angry at you because they don't understand how they got where they are. And the people who made the original decisions around investing in the software might not even be employed by the organization anymore. So, that struggle of meeting the impact sectors where they are at is why this is a challenge for commercial businesses. So what commercial businesses need is a template for understanding how to still make revenue, but make revenue on a different time frame and with a different system of investments in mission-driven organizations to produce profit. Because we're not going to change capitalism, but we can change the way that capitalism thinks about how to engage with mission-driven organizations. Because we are talking about 2 separate economies. we're talking about a profit-based economy for commercial entities, and we're talking about a mission-based economy for impact entities.
I've heard this term activist investor being passed around recently. Is that related to this as well? I don't know.
It is and it's not. Activist investor, in my opinion, and this is just one person's opinion, is an expression for anybody who's bought a substantial amount of our company that we don't like. So it doesn't, in my opinion, align with any political philosophy, because you can find, quote unquote, activist investors on all ends of the political spectrum. There are as many let's extract profit investors as there are we're changing how your business does business fundamentally investors out there. That I think activist investors is just a catchphrase for, we don't like these people who suddenly own our company and they're changing how we do business, and we don't like that either. And sometimes those outcomes are very deleterious, so I get it. But sometimes those organizations push for just the opposite, like pushing oil companies to invest in the environment or safety, or something that looks like managing the externalities of the actual business entity itself.
Okay. There was this really cool AI demo that I saw once, not so long ago, where they were showing different kinds of models of economies.
Mm-hmm.
And they were using different, obviously, levers and filters, inputs and outputs. And they basically proved that pure, unfiltered capitalism tends to drive things in a certain way that isn't favorable for the general community.
Correct.
And they were able to tweak a few things so that there was still enough initiative and reward for those who want to become high profit type of organizations to be able to succeed financially. But there was also certain checks and balances in place so that the high highs and the low lows aren't so far apart from each other. And I thought it was a wonderful way of doing it, to say, look, there is a model out there that exists. And I don't want to get too political in this episode, but the idea is that there is a way to do it. This is not just a theory. There are ways of, to your point, an organization being able to make still profit, because of course we have to make profit and survive and continue to be able to offer more services and offer better impacts. But you can balance that, to your point, with I'm also having an impact to the local community, and they don't have to be completely one against each other. It's not a seesaw, or maybe it is a seesaw, but there's a balance between the two of them where you can have a certain equilibrium and everything still works. The whole system still holds.
Yeah. And that's exactly, you've just hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what I'm trying to propose, is a new lens of thinking about this. And in the case of what I call the impact economy, the lens through which I chose to look at it is, what if we eliminated the constraint of, oh my gosh, we have to meet next quarter's revenue target come hell or high water, and said, let's spread those things out over a period of time that matches impact organizations where they're at, which is 9 to 18 months based on their staff churn, right? So let's look at less profit, but more time, and still see if we can get to the end result. And at the same time, what I've also done is picked up a little bit of libertarian and picked up a little bit of communitarian thinking around how these systems can work together to produce shared outcomes that are both profitable, but also move the needle for impact organizations. And where that puts you, if you follow that to its farthest destination down the road, where that puts you as a business is any number of choices you can make along that path. But if you take it to the nth degree, it has you sitting in a room with your direct competitor saying, all else being equal, we're going to compete with each other in the commercial space until the cows come home. But how do we partner together to make our products and services compatible enough for impact organizations to help alleviate these aggregate investments that happen every 5 to 10 years and waste a ton of money on acquisition and implementation and licensing and actually detract from the work of impact organizations so that they can sustain their work a little bit longer and a little bit stronger in a way that helps them move the needle for us. Because it turns out when you do that, organizations will champion you. And when you have impact organizations championing you, everybody wins. Your business wins because you're able to tell a great story, and those organizations win because maybe this year they don't spend another $35,000 or $200,000 or $800,000 on implementation, configuration, integration, custom this, that, and the other thing, just to keep the lights on.
I think this is a good segue to move towards these partnerships, as you mentioned it a couple of times.
Sure.
And I know you have a very interesting way of looking at it. So
I do.
describe when you use the words and in the pre-show, partnerships for good. Maybe we can define that first before we move on to the other topics.
Absolutely. Partnerships for good is also a phrase of my own expression or creation, should I say. And what I mean by that is when you are a business, and in this case, I will restrict this to when you are a technology company that offers software, either cloud software or desktop software or cloud applications and so forth. There are choices you can make as a business that can accelerate your growth. It is a known that having APIs that business partners can build on is an accelerant to revenue. There was a great Forbes article about this, several of them last year, where they measured it longitudinally, and it was not insubstantial. It was like many percentage points more revenue over time with data integrations and APIs than with, applications that just say use us and use us alone. That is something that many of these large platforms, Salesforce, Microsoft, HubSpot, they take that to heart. But there's also on the opposite end of that seesaw, because I do like your seesaw metaphors, there is a expression called the walled garden. And the walled garden is stay with us. We are the Garden of Eden. We shall provide all of the fruits that you shall need to subsist on. And in so long as you stay within our garden, you're fine. But God's help you if you try to break out of our garden, because we will make that very difficult. And we will make things like extracting your data difficult. We will charge you for it like Blackbaud does. I've worked so many consulting projects where I tried to get data out of a Blackbaud anything. And the first thing that Blackbaud says is, yeah, getting your data out of us will cost $5,000 to $15,000 or more, depending on what data you want. So there are cases where that walled garden approach is terrific for producing revenue over the short term, because what it means is you keep giving your customers more and more shiny objects so that they avoid hitting the wall of your garden. And what has happened over time is that places like Salesforce, which made huge impact for organizations, right? Salesforce was really a pivot point in the early 2000s for how nonprofits globally can access and work with their data and information. And to some degree, the promise of tearing down those walls came true. And to some degree, it did not. And what it did was it moved the walls of the garden far enough away from you so that they're just ever so slightly below the horizon and you really can't see them. So it gives you the illusion of freedom. But in fact, what you've done is just bought into a bigger walled garden. iOS for iPhone does this. Android does this for Android-based phones. Salesforce does this for Salesforce. So why I'm saying this is because it's not an uncommon or even bad practice if all you're doing is looking through the lens of pure revenue acquisition. And what I am suggesting is partnerships for good are the types of business partnerships that for impact organizations help them tear down those walls and work with the tools, work with the strategies, and work with the data they actually need. And that still has not come to fruition. So Partnerships for Good says, okay, we can do two things at once. We can partner together as businesses that have complementary products and sell together, and that's a good thing. But Partnerships for Good also says we should partner together as competitors for the sake of ensuring that the data that nonprofits acquire through our tools is liberated, is freely accessible, has integration options that maybe commercial entities do not, because we recognize that the shape of the mission-based economy is fundamentally different and has raw different needs when it comes to working with our tools than our tools were ever designed to support alone in these giant walled gardens.
So I love the imagery, especially the walled garden, because you're right. When you're in it, it's beautiful. And then you come across the wall, and it's like, that's interesting. And then you realize you're in a prison, but it's a really big prison, and you can see the sky, so it doesn't always feel like one. But I was wondering, besides that analogy, is there some small concrete example we can use going forward? Just because I want to get a better visualization of an actual situation like this.
Okay, I can give you two examples. I think here's a great example that is historically appropriate and also very recent. So I am a huge fan of the folks at Microsoft Tech for Social Impact. I have always thought that the way that they think about data for organizations is very liberating. Now, Microsoft has a very different business model to some degree that allows them to do that, but they've also hired some very forward-thinking people. One of the business models that Microsoft as a company uses are these things called common data models. They have a common data model for education. They have a common data model for manufacturing. I believe they have common data models for auto stuff, right? So why those data models are important is because what they do is they give people who want to integrate their applications to Microsoft's technology stack a landing zone that is appropriate for that data. And it also facilitates data moving back and forth for all of the tech stuff that Microsoft owns and sells, right? Something that Tech for Social Impact tried very hard to do when it came to the nonprofit common data model was say, this model should not be owned by us alone. It should be owned by the impact industry organizations, and we will invite anyone who wants to be a part of its creation and anyone who wants to help figure out how to move data in an aggregate way between organizations, give them a starting point, right? Now, the cynics will tell you, well, that's great, but it only works when you apply it to Microsoft Dynamics. But the dreamers who I know in the room, or who I know were in the room, would also say, sure, we're of course going to make something that works well on our native tools, but we want this to be an industry standard that, application designers can take advantage of, even if they don't, shunt all their stuff over to Microsoft Dynamics. And they invited everybody to be a part of it. And I think, that was met with a great deal of cynicism because, I know what that conversation looked like at Salesforce, and Salesforce said, hell no, these are our competitors. And there were a number of us who said, yes, they're your competitors, but you don't understand the needs of the organizations to whom you're selling, because wouldn't it be great if, just like how you can get Dynamics data inside of Microsoft Office Online, you could get Salesforce data in there too, right? So that's one concrete example of an effort that I think has been repeated at least 3 times in my career, because we were talking about something similar in the early 2000s as well. It's just that the technology wasn't there, in the early 2000s, but now it is. So these industry partnerships that bring people together have been abandoned in the latest round of layoffs, right? So what people have said is, no, we're content with our giant walled gardens. Now, another great example of this on a very much smaller scale is when I have talked to application designers and so forth. There's this chicken and egg conversation that I have with them. And they're like, we would love to blah, 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 sell here, 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 and here. And I say, great. What you need to decide right now as a business is which of these things you're going to support for your customers, and which of these things you're going to spin off and enable your implementation or integration partners to do for you. And time and again, what those conversations end at is, this would be a great idea, except for the fact that I have to put developer resources on it, and my investors need to have me turn a profit in the next 6 months. And that's where they end. So, why I say that some of these discussions begin with investor groups is because investor groups have inordinate amounts of sway over how applications get built, and they have inordinate sway over how those CEOs can allocate their resources when they take everything from their Series A right on through to the rest of the investors. So, a microcosm of that example would be, wouldn't it be great if an investor entity said, actually, we as an entity support moving the needle in aggregate. So while we are looking for return on our investment, we're also going to make an expenditure so that your application or your platform can better work for these organizations and leave the entire subset of them in a better place than when we first started.
In your first example, it sounded like, if I were to distill it just in a couple of keywords, and I know I'm simplifying it greatly, but we're talking about an openness, right? A sharing model where it's about openness, it's about accessibility meaning everyone has access to it. You're really just opening up the gates. Yes, you might have, in Microsoft's case, favoritism toward it might work a bit better in our system, but it doesn't prevent you from using it in other people's systems. So it's just keeping those walls down in the visualization, but at the same time providing some benefits of using our system. And that openness actually helps who exactly?
Sure. Boiling it all the way down to the day-to-day of, a CTO at a nonprofit and someone like I once was, which was an administrator, right? Time and again, what CTOs tell me is the same thing. And that is, I actually don't care if it's X, Y, or Z platform or A, B, and C application. What I actually care about is making sure that it all works and works together, and making sure that the amount of time that everybody else at this organization is spending on serving their constituents can be maximized through the investment in technology, whatever that technology is, right? And where that gets stymied is when these giant walled gardens hit nonprofit business processes that they can't solve for. Because in the ordinary way of doing business, like, here's a great example. Salesforce, it has limits, just like any other platform. Microsoft has limits, Oracle has limits. And I have seen far too many examples as an implementation consultant for Salesforce where Salesforce's answer to the, no, we don't have anything that actually matches what you need, so here is a $200,000 custom project that will force us to do what you need with our stuff, right? Now, sure, you can solve it that way, and the only person that benefits is Salesforce. Or, Salesforce could say, yes, we have recognized that for impact organizations, this particular thing is outside of our swim lanes. So here is a very strategic partnership with an organization or series of businesses that do facilitate this. And we're making this gateway open only for you, impact organizations, because some of these people are our competitors, but we recognize that that's what you need to succeed. And if you boil it all the way down to my day-to-day 15, 20 years ago, however long that was, again, dinosaurs, they make everything a little bit addled. You know, when I was an administrator for some of these systems, it was still the case where it was like, no, we don't want to use Salesforce's email tool. We want to use, SurveyMonkey's email tool or, Cvent's email tool. But because the use cases around why I would choose to use something that wasn't on that platform hadn't really been well digested, where that left me as an administrator was right back towards that problem that we've been trying to solve for 25 years. And that was, great, now I have a giant Excel extract from my email tool, and I've got to somehow figure out how to match that with my people data in Salesforce or Microsoft or wherever. And that doesn't save anybody anything. And there's ways of structuring your partnership programs as a business that can be very exclusive and very supportive of that kind of need, because it recognizes that this is a entity that's making decisions from what's best for their constituents, not what's best for its bottom line.
In terms of trends, as we've seen and we've mentioned organizations that start sometimes with a more open model and then close it, can you imagine or can you foresee, as much as you can, a future where that balance is achieved, where organizations are created and stay within that impact economy, they stay within partnerships for good, and they live there? And the general trend among most organizations are that? Or do you see a trend, is it a struggle and the trend is kind of going in the other direction and we have to push it along as much as possible to get to this nirvana, I guess is a good word of putting it, of this balance, this good balance between keeping things going in terms of the capitalist side of things, but also keeping things going in terms of the impact and the community?
I love that question. I even love your use of nirvana because, I have a little statue on my shelf that obviously nobody can see, but I can. And it is the reclining Buddha. And the reclining Buddha is the Buddha that has attained nirvana. In the short term, in 2023, what I would say is all of these large platforms that purport to do quote unquote impact work have completely regressed. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I can connect a million different dots, but at the end of the day, they've completely regressed. And I know far too many people from far too many places whose only responsibility it was for many of these businesses to meet impact organizations where they're at and establish them on their software. I know far too many of those people who have been summarily laid off and no longer have work for me to say that right now in 2023, we've done anything useful for that, for acquiring and obtaining the impact economy. Do I think that that is a trend that will last forever? No, I do not. Do I think it is attainable in the long term? Yes. Yes, I do. Because what none of those businesses have seen yet is exactly how pissed off so many organizations are for feeling like they had the carpet pulled out from under them for whatever reasons. So I think in the short term, there's pressure. And that's why I put that model out in the first place, was because, not because I think it's 100% correct, but because I think we need to keep thinking about ways to create that pressure and say, actually, no, what you're doing is wrong. But is this attainable in the long term? Absolutely. And what's going to make it attainable, believe it or not, is not impact organizations working together. What's going to make it attainable are the myriad of crises that our world is going to face in the next decade that are going to have to force innovation. And where that innovation is going to have to be forced is enabling the same ecosystem of impact organizations who have always been there, solving the externalities of commercial business and of horrible sort of like practice when it comes to caretaking our planet. So that pressure is going to get created on its own accord, and it already is being created on its own accord. And people are going to start looking at impact organizations and say, save us. Save us from this climate crisis. Save us from the giant swirl of plastic in the Pacific Ocean. Save us from the horrible treatment of people in different countries and different places because of environmental or political or socioeconomic externalities created by capitalism. What I'm telling people is start thinking about how to structure your business now so that your sole business model isn't based on as rapid acquisition of revenue as possible, which creates more of these externalities, and start thinking about ways to, Alex, as you've said, balance that seesaw and start thinking about ways that you can contribute. And that's something that nobody's done yet. Not B Corp as an entity, not any of these like pseudo collaborations, these cloud collaborations. This has to be solved on a business by business basis. And we have to start shaping how we think about it now. Because 5 years from now, if we don't, the crisis our world faces is going to be that much greater.
Tracy, this has been really insightful. Where can people find more about you and perhaps get in touch with follow-up questions?
Sure. You can find me in exactly one place, and that's LinkedIn. I have no social network presence. I have no Twitter account, no Instagram account, no Facebook account, no whatever the young folks are using nowadays accounts. I am on LinkedIn. You can find me there. You can find us online if you look up Why It Matters Nonprofit. We call it a Truthful Tech Talk podcast. You can find us on Apple and Spotify and so forth. But also if you go to whyitmatters.xyz, that will take you to our Sometimes On, Sometimes Off podcast. And lastly, you can also just find me at, Tracy at tracykronzak.com. And I'm happy to have conversations with folks. I am one of the tens of thousands of folks who got laid off between November and January. So, I call it being on team copious free time right now that allows me to think about this stuff until I land the next gig.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. This was extraordinary, and I really appreciate your time and what you're on about. And thanks.
It's my pleasure. All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.